We're in Mark chapter 4, and before I begin to read, I just want us to notice that we're now moving on from a section that we have been exploring over the last few weeks, when Jesus has been teaching the crowds and teaching the disciples, and we've had parables, longer ones, shorter ones, many of them around the theme of seeds and sowing and harvest. And so it has been the word of Jesus that has been foremost, and parables have been something that has been spoken and shared and remembered. But it often seems to me that to understand the Gospels, we need to understand that parables are not only the things that Jesus says, though of course it includes that, but that to a very large extent the whole of Jesus' life is a parable, and often what Jesus does speaks as powerfully as what Jesus says. I mean, we could debate long and hard to what extent some of the situations in Jesus' life, like the one we're about to hear, were in some way orchestrated by Jesus deliberately to make a point. To what extent maybe Jesus just seized opportunities as they arose, not just to tell stories about them, but to enact them, just like the prophets do in the Old Testament from time to time, and they use the circumstances around them to make a point about God's action in the world. But I think the general point here is that what Jesus has to offer us is more than just words, but that Jesus becomes part of the story, becomes part of our story. And if we're to understand the parables of the kingdom, those parables have to be lived as much as they have to be heard and understood. And so let's listen to the story, and to a very large extent my invitation is just to enjoy the story, to embrace the story, and even to enter into the story, because this is the story of the church. It's the story of the calming of the storm. And just think how often we symbolise the church as a boat on a stormy sea, with a cross as a mast in the centre to represent Jesus. This is an image that speaks so powerfully to the story of the church. And then when we've listened, when we've heard, maybe just to pick up some of the deep symbolism that the story carries, which says this is an acted parable of what it means to follow Jesus. And so it's Mark chapter 4, and it starts at verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with them. A great gale arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So if this is the story of the church in acted parable, what are the points where we might stop and pause and ask how this touches our story? Well, first of all, there is that phrase that occurs very often, of course, in the Gospels, that crossing to the other side. And of course, in a world where sea travel, boat travel was one of the fastest and most reliable ways of getting around the Mediterranean world, it's no surprise that Jesus and his disciples were often to be found in boats. They were fishermen, after all, his disciples. But surely we are meant to understand a deeper significance in that sense of crossing to the other side. And often these crossings actually involve going maybe from Jewish to Gentile territory, from one area to another. And certainly the life of the church very often involves us in what can be very scary journeys in terms of going to new territories, unfamiliar territories, places where we are not used to being. Then there is that image of Jesus in the boat, but asleep, a strange aspect to the story in many ways. It brings to mind some of the words of the psalmist, Psalm 121, when the psalmist feels the need to reassure Israel that the God of Israel does not slumber, he does not sleep. Because it can seem very often, even for those of faith, as we try to make sense of the world, it can seem as if God is asleep. And maybe we could be tempted into that kind of deistic theology where we imagine, well, God may have been active at one time, maybe in creation, but God has simply allowed the creation to carry on in its own way. The reminder of the psalmist, but the God of Yahweh does not slumber, does not sleep. And here is Jesus enacting that as he awakes in the midst of the storm. The storm itself is no mere ordinary storm, but it is using language that elsewhere will be used to translate the idea of whirlwind, something about the primeval forces of creation being let loose here, and just sort of emphasizing that sense of Jesus' all-embracing authority, to be caught in the whirlwind when the elemental forces of the universe seem to be battling against us. And there's words of instruction from Jesus to the storm: peace, be still. Reminding us that though we can often use peace in a rather superficial way, maybe in the life of the church we might appear to be offering rather a sort of superficial vision of what peace might be. But this is a deep and profound and all-embracing peace to which Jesus calls the world and his people. And then that final question of the disciples: who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Well, in some ways, of course, that's quite an easy question to ask, unusually for the scriptures, because who has authority over wind and sea but only God, the Creator himself? So here are hints of a deep incarnational theology, that Jesus, as he awakes from sleep in the midst of the storm, is fully representative of all that God is as creator of all things. So let's just enjoy the story. Let's enter the story. Let's allow Jesus not just to tell us the story, but to be the story in our own experience.